6 centuries before Christ, in the Greek colony of Croton in southern Italy, a man arrived by sea who would change the meaning of knowledge. His name was Pythagoras of Samos. He came not as a preacher, nor as a politician, but as an architect of harmony. The world he entered was loud, fragmented by superstition, by tribal pride, by men arguing over gods they no longer understood. In that chaos, he built the first disciplined community of the Western world. Not a temple, not an army, a school of silence. Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos, but his mind belonged to the East. He traveled through Egypt, Phoenicia, and Babylon, studying mathematics, astronomy, and the sacred geometry of temples. In Egypt, he learned that order is divine. In Babylon, he saw number used to map the sky. He returned to Greece with a conviction that truth is a structure, and structure is salvation. When Samos fell under tyranny, he fled. He reached Croton around 530 BCE, a thriving, wealthy city where the youth were restless and the elders corrupt. He saw there what every philosopher sees before founding a school: civilization swollen with noise. Pythagoras believed the cosmos itself was a living harmony. To join that harmony, the soul had to tune itself like an instrument. He taught that numbers were not tools but beings, divine proportions through which the gods built existence. But to perceive that order, one first had to cleanse the senses. The ordinary mind, he said, is deaf from shouting. Silence was not punishment, it was calibration. So he founded the Pythagorean order, a society of men and women who sought truth through discipline, mathematics, music, and moral geometry. Every initiate began the same way, by surrendering the voice. For 5 years, novices were forbidden to speak within the school. They were called acousmatiki, listeners. They sat behind a curtain while the master spoke unseen, learning that the ear refines faster than the tongue. Only after they proved steadiness were they allowed to become mathematici, students of number, proportion, and cosmic law. Why 5 years, though? Because Pythagoras believed that language shapes thought, and untrained language distorts it. Silence rebuilt perception from the ground up. The ancients said they entered as humans and emerged as harmony. The Pythagoreans lived communally. They rose before dawn, greeted the sun with hymns in measured meter, and began study in pure quiet. Their diet was restrained, mostly grains, fruit, and vegetables. They avoided flesh, not for sentiment, but for symmetry. Blood, they believed, clouded ratio. They practiced daily reflection. Before sleep, they asked 3 questions. Where did I fail harmony today? Where did I uphold it? What remains unbalanced? They believed the soul vibrates between lifetimes, carrying unfinished lessons. Through discipline, it could ascend back toward the divine ratio. Unlike any other Greek school, the Pythagorean order welcomed women as equals. Theano, Daimon, Arignoti, Mia, and Timiha studied, taught, and led. Their presence shocked outsiders but fulfilled Pythagoras' law that harmony requires both principles, limit and limitless, masculine and feminine. When the men built theories, the women maintained rhythm in practice, teaching the ethics of proportion in household, childbirth, and governance. Their letters, still surviving in fragments, are the earliest moral philosophy written by women in history. Croton admired the Pythagoreans at first. Their community prospered, their followers disciplined, their children intelligent, their bodies healthy. Soon the city's rulers asked Pythagoras to advise them. He refused wealth but accepted influence. He preached moderation, justice, equality before cosmic law. And that's when power turned. To those profiting from chaos, his order looked like tyranny to the demagogues. His silence looked like conspiracy. Rumors spread that he practiced sorcery, that he held secret rituals to control minds, that he forbade meat to make people weak. In truth, what they feared was not magic, it was unity. To the crowd, silence was suspicion. To the initiate, silence was creation. The Pythagoreans taught that speech without harmony desecrates truth. Each word must be an equation, sound divided by intent. They practiced measured utterance, believing that sound carries spiritual geometry. When they finally spoke, their words stuck like thunder because they were shaped in absence. That's why later philosophers, even Plato, revered the order as those who spoke only when truth could bear weight. Behind the outward rules lay a sacred system. Pythagoras taught mathematics as meditation, the discovery of divinity through structure. He revealed the relationship between length and tone, the octave, the fifth, the fourth. He introduced a theorem that still bears his name, the right triangle as the first perfect balance of space. But the theorem wasn't his aim, it was a metaphor. The triangle symbolized justice, equal sides, equal consequence. The world was to be built by that law. Every ritual, every silence, every calculation was designed to align the soul with the geometry of the gods. It wasn't just the school they wanted to erase, it was proof that humans could live in divine order without needing priests or kings. It was philosophy as independence. Pythagoras' silence gave birth to equality. His mathematics gave birth to democracy. His harmony gave birth to dissent. And that combination terrified the powerful. If you've ever been mocked for restraint, if you've ever been accused of arrogance for staying silent among noise, if you've ever felt truth more clearly when you stopped speaking, you understand the Pythagoreans. They didn't hide wisdom, they protected it from corruption, and the world, unable to tolerate that purity, tried to burn it. For those who live in discipline among noise, join the Catharsians today on Patreon. The Pythagorean path, daily silence, rebuild thought before expression, Diogenes' barrel, defy chaos through simplicity, the Aurelius Council, guard order where the world prefers confusion. They tried to silence harmony. Instead, silence became immortal. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. Silence was not ritual, it was infrastructure. Without it, the Pythagorean order would have collapsed under the weight of its own intelligence. The world called them secretive, they called themselves harmonized. They lived by a rhythm that required absence as much as presence, pause as much as speech. To understand their silence, you must see how it worked. The first level of initiation was acousmatiki, which means listeners. They spent years behind the curtain, never seeing Pythagoras' face. He taught that the senses deceive, but hearing refines. They listened to maxims known as acousmata, concise, cryptic statements that encoded moral law and cosmic proportion. Some examples preserved by later philosophers are the following: do not stir the fire with a knife, which means don't mix aggression with passion. Abstain from beans. which means avoid politics because beans were used for voting. Do not step over the balance, which means don't disturb justice once achieved. Each sounded absurd to outsiders, but formed part of an ethical geometry understood only in sequence. Once the listener internalized harmony, he or she could advance to the rank of mathematici, the learners of number. Only then were they permitted to speak. Speech was privilege, not right. The order's days followed measured symmetry, mourning, purification, silent meditation on geometry and music. Midday, study, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, ethics. Evening, communal meal of bread, honey, fruit, and water, followed by the recitation of moral precepts. Night, reflection. Examine your actions daily, and you will never act without reason. Every conversation was patterned. Theano wrote that speech should fall like measured notes, neither rushed nor delayed. No laughter at another's expense, no interruption. Every sound must serve order. The community's discipline impressed Croton's citizens until it frightened them. The louder the city grew, the quieter the order seemed, and nothing angers chaos more than calm. Merchants whispered that Pythagoras was forming a theocracy. Politicians claimed he was enslaving youth through mysticism. Poets mocked the silence as mind control. When Croton's rulers realized that even noble families sent their sons and daughters to the order instead of to politics, they panicked. They accused the Pythagoreans of hoarding divine knowledge. A movement began, the Cylonian revolt, led by a local aristocrat named Silene, a rejected applicant. He spread the rumor that Pythagoras demanded worship and controlled his followers with spells. The result was the first recorded persecution of philosophers. Around 510 BCE, the mob gathered before the meeting hall in Croton. They broke the doors, set the building ablaze. Many of the mathematici died inside, trapped by the same silence that had once freed them. Some escaped to Tarentum and Metapondum, carrying fragments of their master's work. Pythagoras himself fled north. Ancient sources differ. Some say he died soon after, others that he starved himself in grief. But all agree the world had destroyed what it couldn't understand. Croton's citizens thought they'd ended a cult. They had, in fact, extinguished the first organized scientific and ethical institution in human history. The few survivors codified what they could remember into the Golden Verses, a series of moral aphorisms that echo the rhythm of the original teachings. They taught, let your tongue not outrun your thought. Seek measure in all things. Choose as friend the man who seeks virtue. These verses became the blueprint for later Stoicism and early Christian monastic rules. The silence of the order thus survived as conscience, the sense that speech must earn its right to exist. While other Greeks debated ideas publicly, the Pythagoreans treated philosophy as architecture. Every theorem, every ethical law had to support the next. Speech was a beam, logic was tension, silence was foundation. They didn't argue, they built. That's why their legacy endures while louder schools vanished. Even Plato's dialogues preserve their structure: question, measure, balance, silence. His academy was the order reborn in intellectual form. The world that burned them soon drowned in its own chatter. Politicians shouted virtue they didn't live. Sophists sold wisdom by the hour. Democracy, newly born, confused speech with truth. Against that chaos, the silent order seemed alien. They weren't wrong, they were too advanced. Their silence was civilization's missing element, discipline before expression. Without it, Athens slid into demagoguery, and later Rome into spectacle. After Pythagoras' death, Theano of Croton took leadership of the dispersed order. She and her daughters rebuilt fragments of the teaching in exile. They created small circles across Magna Graecia, hidden domestic academies that preserved harmony through ritual, not visibility. In Theano's letters, she reminded disciples, guard measure as you would guard fire. She understood that the world that killed Pythagoras would do so again, so she taught invisibility as protection. That decision saved philosophy. Without her restraint, Pythagoreanism would have died with Croton. To the uninitiated, silence is void. To the trained, it's the purest medium of transfer. Theano wrote that in silence. Souls recognize one another. This is why the order could vanish and still survive. Its knowledge was not stored in books, but in character. Every disciplined life became a manuscript. Plato, centuries later, called this anamnesis, recollection, knowledge carried by the soul. He was describing the afterlife of the Pythagoreans. They weren't persecuted for geometry or veganism or mysticism. They were persecuted for incorruptibility. They proved that a community could live without debt, greed, or flattery, an economy of virtue rather than currency. That kind of independence endangers every hierarchy built on dependence. So the world, as always, tried to destroy what reminded of its own noise. If you've ever been punished for calm, if you've ever seen noise exalted over depth, if your silence has been mistaken for submission, you understand the Pythagoreans. You are a Pythagorean. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon for those who refine voice through absence. The Pythagorean path. Practice the geometry of speech. Remove excess sound. Diogenes' barrel. Guard freedom through refusal. The Aurelius Council, the New Order, structure over noise, harmony over hysteria, leadership. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and reclaim your power as the leader you were always meant to be. By the end of the 6th century BC, the city of Croton had become the envy of Magna Graecia. Its athletes dominated the Olympic Games, its merchants grew rich, and its citizens boasted that their laws were the most balanced in Italy. Behind that civic harmony stood the quiet influence of the Pythagorean order, but harmony breeds jealousy. The louder Croton's assemblies became, the more suspicious they grew of those who refused to shout. At first, the Pythagoreans were advisors to the city. Their students were judges, doctors, teachers, and counselors. Their ethics, justice as proportion, temperance as symmetry, made Croton efficient and wealthy. Soon their community owned no property individually, they shared everything in common. To the oligarchs, they looked like Trajan. They feared a second government rising within the first, one ruled by virtue instead of lineage. A discontented nobleman named Silon applied for initiation and was rejected. The records say he lacked harmony of character. Humiliated, he vowed revenge. He began whispering that Pythagoras was a foreign sorcerer who enslaved youth through spells and vegetarian diets. He told the elders that women in the order practiced forbidden rites at night. He claimed the silence hid political plotting. Rumor grew like fire beneath the floorboards of the city. Around 510 BC, while Pythagoras was away in the nearby town of Metapondum, Cylon gathered a mob. They stormed the main meeting hall, where more than 40 Pythagoreans were studying. They barred the doors and set it alight. Ancient historians disagree on details, but all describe the same image. Philosophers trapped among their diagrams, choosing not to scream as the flames rose. Some accounts say only two escaped, Archippus and Lysis, who fled to Thebes and carried the remnant of the teaching north. Others claim Pythagoras returned, saw the destruction, and refused food until he died. The flames consumed not only people, but manuscripts, the earliest treatises of geometry, astronomy, and music theory. Centuries of Greek science were erased in a single night. To later philosophers, that night symbolized the conflict between order and opinion, silence and noise. It wasn't just Croton's envy that killed them, it was civilization's impatience with discipline. They represented the possibility of a just society built on proportion rather than power. Their silence was a mirror showing the mob its own dissonance, and the mob smashed the mirror. The tragedy became legend. The house of Milo burned, and with it the harmony of the world. Survivors scattered across southern Italy and Greece. In Tarentum, Archytas, a later disciple, rebuilt the order in miniature. He became a general, mathematician, and statesman, the only man Plato ever called friend. Archytas governed by the same ratios Pythagoras had taught: proportion between ruler and ruled, wealth and need, war and mercy. Through him, the Pythagorean ethic entered politics again, disguised as practical wisdom. When Plato visited Tarentum, he absorbed that geometry of justice and carried it back to Athens. Thus, from the ashes of Croton came the architecture of the academy. Read Plato carefully, and the ghost of Pythagoras appears everywhere: the harmony of the spheres in the Timaeus, the transmigration of souls in the Phaedo, the mathematical guardians in the Republic. Even his insistence that philosophers must rule comes from Archytas' example. For Plato, the silent community of Croton became the model for the ideal city, a place where reason, not appetite, governs. In that way, the world that murdered the Pythagoreans ended up ruled by their ideas. After Plato came the Neo Pythagoreans, men like Philolaus and Eurytus, who tried to restore the lost system. Philolaus wrote that all things are composed of limit and unlimited, reviving the old doctrine of opposites. Eurytus described numbers of archetypes of being, the scaffolding of creation. By the first century BCE, Pythagorean thought merged with Stoicism and early mysticism. In Alexandria, scholars translated it into Egyptian and Hebrew concepts of cosmic order, the idea that Logos, divine reason, permeates the universe came directly from their harmony of number. What the fire tried to erase became the skeleton of Western thought. Why did they fail politically? Because they refused compromise. They would not flutter, would not shout, would not dilute their teaching to survive. That purity, admirable to philosophers, was lethal in politics. Pythagoras underestimated envy. He believed virtue could persuade corruption. He was wrong. But his failure birthed philosophy's greatest lesson: that truth must sometimes hide to survive. The silence that began as discipline became camouflage. For centuries, thinkers adopted masks: mathematicians, priests, mystics, so the fire could not find them again. The women of the order, Theano, Deimo, Arignuti, Mia, and Timiha, became the first activists of exile. While men fled into public life, they preserved fragments in households and letters. Theano wrote of harmony between husband and wife as the smallest unit of justice. Demo guarded her father's writings and refused every bribe for them, saying truth cannot be bought without dying. Through them, the lineage survived. When the public world turned hostile, they transformed silence from restriction into protection. A century later, Croydon citizens tried to rehabilitate their past. They built shrines to Pythagoras, claiming him as native hero, but the philosophers never returned. The older silence had become generational. The city's wealth faded, its politics fractured, and this harbor filled with silt. Historians called it justice, the balance restored. The world that had burnt harmony fell into dissonance and never fully recovered. The Catharsians sees the burning of Croydon not as a tragedy, but as a pattern. Every age repeats it. The few build order, the many destroy it, and the idea resurrects elsewhere. From Croydon to Athens, from Athens to Rome, from Rome to every disciplined mind that chooses silence over noise, the line continues. To live by ratio is to invite persecution, but persecution proves propulsion. If you've ever built something orderly in a culture addicted to chaos, if you've watched your work burn and still felt clarity instead of hate, you are a Pythagorean. You share the lineage of the Pythagoreans. Don't waste more time among placeholders. You don't belong to their systems. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon. For those who rebuild after destruction, the Pythagorean path, construct again. Silence outlasts flame. Diogenes barrel, laugh at ruin, mock power with integrity. The Aurelius Council, architects of rebirth, leaders who treat loss as geometry, join the Catharsian Patreon today and build with harmony. When Croydon burned, the silence scattered. It drifted east to Greece, north to Thebes, and west across the Italian coast. The world thought the order finished. Instead, it dissolved into the bloodstream of civilization. Among those who escaped the blaze were Lysis and Philolaus. They carried no scrolls, only memory. Lysis found refuge in Thebes, where he opened a small circle of disciples. One of them was Epaminondas, the general who later freed Thebes from Spartan control. From him, the harmony of virtue passed into strategy. Even war was to obey ratio. Philolaus traveled farther north. Around 430 BC, he settled in Tarentum and later in Thebes, where he finally dared to write what had once been spoken only behind curtains. His book, On Nature, now lost except for fragments, was the first to claim openly that the earth moves in harmony with a central fire. That single heretical phrase would echo through Copernicus, Kepler, and every astronomer thereafter. Silence had become orbit. A century after Pythagoras, Archytas rebuilt the oldest discipline as mathematics and mechanics. He was a statesman, engineer, and general, proof that geometry could rule cities as well as minds. He discovered the mathematical foundation of mystical pitch and designed the first non mechanical flying device, a wooden dove powered by air pressure. Yet, Archytas was not inventor for vanity. He wrote that no instrument serves the mind unless it obeys propulsion. Under his governance, Tarentum prospered without tyranny. Citizens said his rule was music made visible. It was Archytas who later welcomed Plato to Italy and rescued him from the dictator Dionysius of Syracuse. Their friendship forged the bridge between mathematics and philosophy that defines Western thought. Plato returned to Athens carrying fragments of the lost harmony. He reassembled them into dialogue. Where Pythagoras had required 5 years of silence, Plato demanded 5 years of mathematics before any student could study politics. In the Timaeus, he transformed the Pythagorean cosmos into architecture. Earth equals cube, water icosahedron, air octahedron, fire tetrahedron, ether dodecahedron. Geometry became theology. To know shape was to know God. Through him, the Pythagorean fire entered the bloodstream of every later school. The Stoics, the Neoplatonists, even the early Christians who called the logos of the word a vibration, a ratio. By the 1st century BC, Pythagoreanism had resurfaced as a moral philosophy within Rome. Statesmen such as Cicero and Varro admired its ethics of measure and moderation. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Pythagoras speaks again, condemning animal sacrifice and preaching the unity of all life. Roman Stoics adopted the mathematics of virtue. Seneca called reason a harmony of the soul. Epictetus spoke of the inner citadel built on symmetry. Marcus Aurelius ruled by propulsion rather than passion. None of them called themselves Pythagoreans, but the geometry of Croton structured their conscience. When Alexander's empire opened the world, Greek thought fused with Egyptian order and Eastern mysticism. In Alexandria, the Pythagorean current resurfaced under new names: Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, all seeking reunion with a cosmic harmony. There, Euclid complied the elements, organizing geometry into proofs that mirrored Pythagoras' moral structure, each theorem deriving balance from what preceded it. Eratosthenes measured the earth. Ptolemy mapped the heavens by musical ratio. Even theology became mathematical. Every Christian thinkers used number to interpret creation, the Trinity as triad, salvation as restoration of symmetry. The order silence had turned into system, the restraint became method. By the end of the 1st century BC, Apollonius of Tyana claimed to live by the ancient discipline of Croton. He traveled the Mediterranean teaching asceticism, veganism, and moral geometry. To the populace, he was magician. To historians, he was a philosopher in exile. Roman emperors feared his following because he needed neither wealth nor approval. His letters mirror Pythagoras' tone: calm, corrective, exact. He called noise the sacrilege of the mouth. Even persecution repeated itself. Under Domitian, he was arrested for sorcery, tried, and, like Pythagoras, vanished from the record, half myth, half echo. The most tangible survival of the order was sound. Their discovery that pitch follows ratio 2 to 1 for octave, 3 to 2 for fifth, 4 to 3 for fourth, formed the base of Western music. Church chant, cathedral architecture, and even Gregorian notation carry their fingerprints. The silence that once trained the ear in Croton eventually built the cathedrals of Europe, stone frozen into melody. While men wrote the treatises, women kept the rhythm of the discipline. In scattered cities, from Tarentum to Delphi, groups descendant from Theano and Deimo continued teaching ethics through household symmetry, justice and distribution of food, order in speech, purity in thought. Inscriptions show their names: Phintes, Isera of Lucania, Peristion, each wrote on the harmony of the human soul. They extended Pythagoras' mathematics into psychology, the mind as triad, reason, spirit, desire, needing balance to achieve virtue. Centuries before Plato's tripartite soul, these women were mapping it in their letters. Ideas that arise from propulsion cannot be erased, they reform wherever balance is rediscovered. The fire of Croton migrated through philosophy, religion, art, and science because it described something permanent, the architecture of order itself. Every civilization that valued symmetry revived it through realizing the source. The Egyptians in temples, the Romans in law, the Christians in liturgy, the Muslims in geometry, all were unknowing heirs of the silent city that burned. The world destroys bodies, harmony simply changes the instruments. To the Catharsian, this diaspora is proof that truth never dies, it only alters frequency. Silence was not defeat, it was transmission mode. When one generation burns, another remembers. This is why Pythagorean thought appears whenever civilization seeks structure after chaos. The modern seeker, surrounded by digital noise, stands in the same position as the exiles of Croton, carrying propulsion through confusion. If you have rebuilt yourself after losing everything ordered, if you have carried principles instead of possessions, if you have learned to move quietly until it's safe to build again, you are a Pythagorean. You are proof that fire can travel without smoke. Join the Catharsian today, begin your Catharsian path forward. The Pythagorean path, restore measure through study, let history itself be meditation. Diogenes' barrel, life portable, carry virtue as structure. The Aurelius Council, design order that outlives empires. Every time civilization collapses, silence gathers the fragments. You are that fragment. You are a Pythagorean. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon and reclaim your suppressed power. In the 15th century, scholars digging through monasteries rediscovered the Greek texts that had survived in Arabic translation, Euclid, Plato, and the fragments of Pythagoras' followers. Artists and architects seized on them as if remembering a dream. Brunelleschi used mathematical ratio to design the Dome of Florence. Leonardo da Vinci measured anatomy by the same triangles that once symbolized justice. Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar, wrote the Divina Proportione on divine proportion, reviving the sacred geometry of Croton under the blessing of the Church. What had been Hersley in Croton became holiness in Florence. The Pythagorean theorem, once whispered behind curtains, was now painted into ceilings, carved into cathedrals, and sung in hor. The silence of the order has transfigured into art, so precise it looked like prayer. The 16th century turned geometry outward. Copernicus, reading ancient sources, revived Philolaus' heretical vision of the moving earth. Kepler read the Timaeus and called his own work the harmony of the world, a phrase straight from Pythagoras. He wrote, "The movements of the planet are nothing but eternal polyphony." With Galileo, mathematics became experiment. With Newton, it became law. Each step traced back to the doctrine that the universe is governed by ratio. Even when theology opposed them, these thinkers moved like the Pythagoreans, silent, patient, certain that numbers would speak for themselves. Their calm in persecution echoed the same unbroken geometry that had guided the order centuries before. By the 18th century, the Pythagorean ideal, reason as harmony, became the foundation of modern governance and ethics. Constitutions were written in geometric symmetry, checks balancing powers, laws written in measured clauses. The same proportion that tuned strengths now tunes societies. Philosophers like Leibniz and Kant inherited the discipline unconsciously. Both were performing the Pythagorean order in a new language, logic. The world had finally accepted what Croton burned for, that harmony is not mystical but mechanical, that morality is mathematics of the will. Yet progress brought noise. The Industrial Revolution multiplied voices, machines, and appetites. Silence became scarce again. The Pythagorean spirit survived where order still required quiet, in observatories, laboratories, and studios. Every scientist staring through a telescope alone at night, every composer sketching harmony before dawn, every engineer drafting perfect symmetry, they were all repeating the same discipline: withdraw, measure, speak only through precision. Silence returned as professionalism, the calm rigor of those who build while others shout. Today, the true heirs of Pythagoras are not mystics or mathematicians alone. They're every person who builds structure in a collapsing world, the coder who engineers clarity in algorithms, the philosopher who defends reason against hysteria, the artist who edits noise into form, the scientist who refuses fraud for fame. Each, knowingly or not, obeys the same law: speak only when the sound creates order. Silence has become rebellion again. Discipline is the new heresy. To the Catharsian, the story ends where it began. The silence that birthed philosophy must return to purify it. The world has too many voices and too little virtue. The Catharsian mission is not to preach harmony, but to embody it through measured speech, moral geometry, and incorruptible calm. Every post, every video, every teaching must carry proportion. This is how the ancient fire survives in the age of noise. The Pythagoreans lived in silence because they knew what speech costs. They watched the world destroy them for protecting truth, and they remained silent even in the flames. That silence was not defeat, it was victory in its highest form, the triumph of order over chaos, of inner law, of outer madness. If you are tired of noise disguised as thought, if you feel the hunger for stillness beneath the flood of opinions, if you sense that truth cannot be shouted, only tuned, you are part of the returning order. You're a Catharsian, you're a Pythagorean. Join the Catharsians today on Patreon, the Pythagorean Path, Diogenes' Barrel, or the Aurelius Council, and reclaim your power as a leader.